Who was Abraham? If Jews constantly refer to Abraham as their forefather and refer to themselves as the chosen people while treating all other peoples as second-class beings, then it is time for us to consider who Abraham actually was. First, Abraham was not a Jew, not even when God said to him, "And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee." Second, Abraham was called by God the father of many nations, and not just the father of the Jews. "Neither shall thy name any more be called Abram, but thy name shall be Abraham, for a father of many nations have I made thee." Third, and if Abraham were, strictly speaking, only the father of the Jews, then he would probably not be the father of all the other 11 tribes of Israel. King Saul, after all, was not a Jew. Likewise, Isaac, Saul, Samson, Deborah, Gideon, Elijah, Joshua, Ephraim, Moses, Aaron, Jacob, and many others. It has always been a deception of Bible translators to suggest to us that the Bible is only about Jews. Yet the word Jew doesn't even appear in the original scriptures, but is always correctly referred to as Judean, because they lived in the land of Judea and were descendants of only one of Jacob's 12 sons, who was called Judah. However, in many places, the otherwise often more correct term Israelites would be more appropriate than Judeans, in order to include all 12 tribes of Jacob and not just emphasize a single tribe of the 12 tribes. Presumably, even back then, the authors of both testaments wanted to point to the second most important person in the Bible after God, Jesus Christ. The mixing of these terms is not bad in itself. What is worrying, however, is that there are groups that have built a new religion around this word, which does not even appear in the original scriptures. Especially in the last 200 years, there have been approximately 30 million Zionist Christians in the United States who actually believe that only the Jews are the God's chosen people. This deception is called the Abraham trick. A further 30 million Christian Zionists in Europe have also adopted this Abraham trick and also believe that only the Jews are the only valid chosen people of God. Through this deception, the evangelicals, along with their TV preachers, want to make us believe that only through the grace of the Jews and only through our blind obedience do we still have any chance of receiving a free pass for the rapture when the time comes. In fact, for us, only one single relationship is of the utmost importance to us. It is the relationship to Abraham, which is not determined by bloodline, but a relationship determined by faith in God and His Son, Jesus Christ. So there is therefore only one line to Abraham. It is a spiritual one, not an ethnic one. That was the only reason Abraham was chosen. Only for that. So God promised to send him prophets, and ultimately Jesus Christ, whose earthly parents were indeed descendants of Abraham. This primarily spiritual connection indicates that Abraham was the first Christian and the father of Christians, not of Jews. Why Israel? Along with Abraham, God also chose a group of people who were to point toward the coming of the Messiah. The Israelites were to be the first to receive prophecies about Jesus so they would recognize him when he came. Elijah, Elisha, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Ezekiel, and Daniel were just a few of these prophets. They too gave prophecies about the coming Messiah. The Israelites were supposed to recognize Jesus and then spread this good news throughout the world. Furthermore, the Israelites were chosen so that through their lives and actions within their community, they would reveal the nature, character, and disposition of the true God. That was the reason why Jesus said he came only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Instead, the Israelites became arrogant, proud, and bigoted, believing they were better than all the other pagan nations around them, and believing that God loved them more than any other nation in the world, much as many evangelicals do today. None of the other pagan nations were given such prophecies. Thus, all the neighboring nations also had no idea who God was. Only the Israelites received them. That is all it means. So it doesn't mean that the Israelites were something special, or that they were chosen so that God would save them because of their lineage. The Israelites weren't chosen because they were so good or so exceptional. They were chosen to fulfill a special task, a task at which, unfortunately, they failed miserably. What did they do? They failed to recognize Jesus. They captured him, insulted him, spat on him, beat him, and tortured him. Ultimately, they murdered their own Messiah. Who are the Jews, and who are they not? Today, Jews, if they follow the Babylonian Talmud, are the spiritual, not the physical, descendants of the Pharisees. The same Pharisees whose doctrines Jesus so vehemently rejected as they emerged from precisely those traditions. Realistically speaking, the vast majority of Jews today have no physical or ethnic connection to the Israelites of ancient times, but rather a spiritual connection to the Pharisees who murdered Jesus and continued to live according to the doctrines of the Babylonian Talmud. Their original mission was to spread good news throughout the world and proclaim that Jesus Christ was and is the Messiah. But they failed to do so. They kept the message to themselves, returned to paganism, and eventually even killed their own Messiah. Connection to the Old Testament. In order not to make things difficult for my Jewish friends, I will use only one single verse from the New Testament and all the other verses exclusively from the Old Testament. Here are some of the numerous Old Testament passages that provide clear references to Jesus and, by extension, Christianity. Psalm 110, verse 1. Isaiah, chapter 7, verse 14. Isaiah, chapter 53, verse 5. Zechariah, chapter 9, verse 9. Daniel, chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. Micah, chapter 5, verse 2. Isaiah, chapter 53, the Passion. Hosea, chapter 11, verse 1. Deuteronomy 18, verse 15. And finally, by far the most important verse in the Old Testament that provides a clear and unambiguous reference to Jesus Christ. It is the verse 3:15 of Genesis. Already on the very first pages of the Bible, God prophesies the victory of Jesus Christ over Satan and simultaneously establishes Christianity as the only religion in the Bible. Additional interesting aspect of this verse is that God mentions not only Satan, but also his descendants. Descendants who, as we know, continues to control the misfortunes on the earth to this day. Furthermore, the verse also mentions a heel that will be bruised by these descendants, which can only refer to Jesus Christ's heel. And finally, the significance of the bruising of Satan's head cannot be overlooked. The head has always been regarded as the symbol of the center of thought and power in every human being. In the past, even a crown was placed on this head to further emphasize the power and influence of these kings and other potentates. So we can see that with or without a crown, the Bible is still highly relevant to this very day. And so it is not surprising that the New Testament states, "Search the Scriptures, because in them you think you have eternal life, and they are they which testify of me." So God's encounter with Abraham was the beginning of Christianity, and the Garden of Eden was the place where Christianity emerged before all other religions. Christianity did not emerge from Judaism. Judaism is an offshoot of Christianity and emerged about 300 years after the Jews killed Jesus Christ and eventually wrote down their Babylonian Talmud in southern Europe. This was precisely what the Pharisees brought back from their captivity. It was pure paganism, and when they finally wrote down these thoughts, it became their Babylonian Talmud, the holiest book of the Jews today. The conclusion. From today's perspective, one can say that Jews and Christians initially formed a single entity. They were identical. This was the period from the introduction of God's covenant with Abraham until the murder of Jesus. The murder of Jesus marked the first irreconcilable rift between the two groups. This rift was finally sealed when the Pharisees later wrote down the Babylonian Talmud. From that point on, the two religions separated definitively and became diametrically opposed to each other. Only when the Jews recognize that Jesus is the true Messiah will they begin to understand the Bible as it was originally intended. As a European, I know what I'm talking about. For almost 2 millennia, a few Christian nations in Europe were almost uninterruptedly the greatest criminals and murderers in the world. First within Europe, and later on every other continent of this planet. Only since the end of the Second World War that we have finally learned to bury our eternal conflicts, as long as they aren't being fueled by other entities. Since these individuals are well known to anyone who walks through the world with open eyes today, it is still possible to stay on the path to peace, if we only make it our mission.